Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, or if you're watching this before bedtime, welcome. Thank you very much for coming today. Uh, and thank you, Coppermark, for inviting me to join their webinar today. My name is Mingyu Yang. I'm the responsible sourcing analyst from the London Metal Exchange. You might have seen emails coming from us previously. Again, thank you very much for coming. And Michelle, why don't you introduce yourself as well?
Absolutely. Welcome, everyone. My name is Michelle Brillhard. I'm the Executive Director of the Coppermark. We're very pleased to have you today on the webinar. Hopefully, we'll be able to spend a useful hour with us here today.
And just to note, this webinar will be recorded so that we can disseminate it to people that won't be able to join us today. So just wanted to say that before we get started. Michelle, you can start recording whenever.
Yep, the recording is in progress.
Awesome. And before we go into the details of how can Coppermark help copper, lead, nickel, and zinc brands reach compliance with LME's responsible sourcing policy, we have a few words from our CEO, Matthew Chamberlain. He is unfortunately cannot join on Zoom call today, but he recorded a message because responsible sourcing is very important to the exchange and to himself as well. So I'm going to quickly share that video.
Good morning or afternoon or evening, everyone, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Matthew Chamberlain, and I am the CEO of the London Metal Exchange. I'm delighted to be here today at the Coppermark seminar, and many thanks to the Coppermark for inviting me and asking me to say a few words. Copper is a key metal for the LME. Copper and tin were the first metals listed on our exchange back in 1877. And copper remains one of our biggest contracts, with 93 brands listed for good delivery against trades on the exchange, the most of any of our metals. This is a reflection on the size of the global copper market and how important the metal is for the development of infrastructure and manufacturing worldwide. And this becomes even more true as we increasingly focus on the need to achieve growth and progress in a sustainable manner. To that end, as I think you'll all know, in 2019, the LME introduced responsible sourcing requirements. In part, this was to reflect this increased focus on sustainability, but also at a more granular level for us to ensure that those stakeholders trading metal on the exchange, producers, consumers, merchants, banks, would not run the risk that they were trading on and possibly even taking delivery of metals which had not been responsibly sourced. Now, this wasn't an easy process. We debated extensively whether it was the role of an exchange to take action here, and the market, at least initially, was not united on this point. Ultimately, it became clear that this work would be essential for us as an industry, and hence important for the LME to do everything it could to support this great effort. We took 2 years of extensive market engagement to write the rules, and the copper industry, led by the ICA, IWCC, and the Coppermark, played a crucial role in ensuring that these requirements strike the right balance between meaningful rules and practical implementation. We were particularly conscious that this was the first time the OECD due diligence guidance, on which our requirements are based, would be used for copper and other base metals not classed as conflict minerals. The Coppermark has continued to be vital to the success of this program. It is one of our Track A standards, which means that producers of LME listed metals can use the Coppermark to comply with the LME's responsible sourcing requirements. More broadly, the Coppermark's work on supporting the global effort to ensure that mining supply chains are free from human rights abuses, conflict financing, and other responsible sourcing issues is absolutely crucial. But of course, the copper mark isn't just about copper. It covers zinc, lead, and nickel too, all LME metals. The LME has 235 brands across these four metals, and over our whole contract suite, 52% are using Track A standards such as the copper mark. Of course, none of this would be relevant without the strong support of producers worldwide, many of whom I know are on this webinar today. Thank you so much for taking on this challenge to move our industry forward as a beacon of good practice, and of course for being such a key part of the LME's global ecosystem. We know how much work it takes to demonstrate compliance, how difficult, time-consuming, and resource-intensive that work is. We wouldn't at the LME have taken this route if we didn't believe it was vital to ensure our ongoing social license to operate. But we know that you too believe that it is the right thing to do, and that we all want to work in an industry that lives up to its ethical responsibilities. I'm very proud to be part of that effort, and please do let us know if there are other ways we can help to support you through this process. On that note, I know that deadlines for LME reporting are approaching. I urge you not to leave this to the last minute, as the work is difficult and complicated. But the Coppermark team, led by Michelle, is fantastic, and they will help and support you through the process. The team at the LME is also here if you have questions for us. And we are very much looking forward to receiving your audit reports by the 31st of December this year. Many thanks again, and I hope you have a great webinar.
All right, with that, we wanted to first start with a pool. And this pool is really trying to gauge how prepared everyone is in meeting the LME's end of year deadline for Track A. And right now, I think Michelle is going to launch that pool for everyone.
It just muted me for no reason. You should be seeing a pop-up window on your screen now, where you have the ability to click on the response, and that seems to be working. I can see people responding. Well, just, you give it a little bit of time. We have about 30% of the attendees that have responded so far.
Awesome.
And that is increasing, so if you haven't looked at the poll yet, please give it just a few seconds so that we can pick up a few more responses, but it's a pretty active, group here today, and a very balanced set of responses. You were at 32 responses, coming up to about 60% of the participants. I suggest we leave it just a little longer. To be able to give everyone a chance to click on the answer that they prefer or feel is most appropriate. Seems to be slowing down a bit. So please take another few seconds here. If you haven't had the chance yet to give your response, please do so now. We'll be closing the poll in a few seconds here. All right, so let me share the result, which you should be seeing. Is that working, Mingyu?
Awesome. Yeah, I see. So we have 44% of our participants saying they're feeling confident about how to meet LME's responsible sourcing requirements, which means for the rest of the, I suppose, 54% 56% of the people, this webinar hopefully will be useful for you if you're not quite confident yet on how to reach compliance to LME's responsible sourcing requirements, or you don't have any LME brands, you just want to understand, what is required of the requirements potentially in the future. If you want to list a brand, then you'll have a better understanding as well on how to use Coppermark or joint due diligence standard. So with that, let's get started with the presentation. So the LME's responsible sourcing requirements was published in 2019. And after that requirement was introduced, we had our first deadline for the OECD guidance portion of the requirements last year in June 30th. And that's when producers had to inform us, if they're using Track A, which standard they will be uptaking to meet our requirements. And then and that's also the portion that we'll be focusing on today with Coppermark. And we also don't want to forget about the two ISO standards, the International Standard Organization certificates. One is the ISO 14001, Environmental Management Systems or equivalent, and the ISO 45001, Occupational Health and Safety Management Systems or equivalent. I say equivalent because if you are a producer who's doing the full Coppermark standard, we also recognize that full Coppermark as equivalent to our two ISOs, and then we will talk about that in a little bit later. But the focus today is really on the OECD due diligence guidance requirements, but also just wanted to mention those two ISOs as well. And so there are 4 tracks that a producer can meet the LME's responsible sourcing requirements, which we call Track A, Track B, Track C, and Track D. So the one that, again, we focus on today is the Recognized Alignment Assessed Standard track. But if you have questions on the other tracks, feel free to reach out or ask questions during the Q&A. Track B and Track C are for producers that do not identify any red flags in their supply chain and wish to complete a self-assessment or what we call a red flag assessment template. And with Track B, you can either submit that red flag assessment template to an auditor, and that auditor would then send an audit report to the LME and tell us that there is no red flag being evaluated or being discovered in the assessment. And for Track C, you will then send that red flag assessment to the LME, and we will review it, and we will let you know the LME has accepted it. And Track D, I assume there's probably no one today that sources 100% secondary material to produce their LME brands. But if this is news to you, if you're just discovering this today, brands that source 100% of secondary material to produce LME metal can also fill out this attestation form, and then they're basically exempt from implementing the OECD guidance requirements. But again, the focus today will be on Track A, the Recognized Alignment Assessed Standard track. So what does Track A mean? Industry standards have been doing this work to address sustainability issues in the mineral supply chain for quite a while, and some of the standard requirements cover the implementation of the OECD due diligence guidance. The LME does not want to reinvent the wheel or make producers do duplicate work by creating a new standard. So we recognize standards that have already been aligned or have undergone the alignment assessment process to be aligned with the OECD due diligence guidance. So by obtaining a certificate from either for example, today we have the joint due diligence standard and Coppermark with Michelle on the call. By getting a certificate from those two standards, you basically demonstrate compliance to these standards, and the LME will recognize that compliance, and you'll meet our responsible sourcing requirements as well. So one last point on this slide, for Copper Mark, you can either use the joint due diligence standard or the full Copper Mark standard for lead, nickel, zinc brands. And you can also use the joint due diligence standard. The joint due diligence standard can be assured either by Responsible Mineral Initiative or the Copper Mark. And then Michelle will also go into a little bit of detail on that one later. Since last year, since 30th of June last year, brands had to tell us which standard they're using. And we discovered, out of 450 brands, about 41% of LME brands are planning on using one of the alignment assessed standards to comply through track A. And in that, we have 65 out of those 41%, or 65 out of that 228 brands chose either the joint due diligence standard, or 28 out of that 228 brands chose the full Copper Mark from all of the track A brands. So the uptake for joint due diligence standard and Copper Mark is quite global and quite high as well. With that, I will hand it to Michelle to explain why the joint due diligence standard and what the standard offers.
Great, thank you so much, Mingyu. So to start at the beginning, why would you take track A with the joint due diligence standard? The joint due diligence standard was developed essentially to help brands meet the LME's responsible sourcing requirements. I know that sounds circular, but it's to highlight that the very reason we have developed this tool is to support the brands in their compliance with LME. It also is a collaborative effort. So back in 2020, when we started looking at the responsible sourcing rules, we quickly, came together with nickel, zinc, and lead to say, let's not have 4 different tools. Let's collaborate and make this into one framework using existing infrastructure from the Copper Mark, so we can create efficiencies and make sure that we have the best possible pathways for brands to comply with the LME's expectations. So what that means when I talk about the best possible pathways is that there are 2 different options to use the joint due diligence standard, either alone, so standalone, as we say, which means you just go through an audit against the joint due diligence standard, and that will be enough to meet just the responsible sourcing requirements of the LME. As Mingyu mentioned, that doesn't include the environmental or occupational health and safety expectations. However, you can also join the Copper Mark, and in the Copper Mark, we have 32 different criteria, so different standard expectations. And number 31 of the 32 is the joint due diligence standard. So by doing the full Copper Mark, a particular site will be able to meet all 3 expectations of the LME at the same time, so also the environmental and occupational health and safety requirement. Both the standalone assessment or the full Copper Mark are going through the Copper Mark's infrastructure, so to speak, so our assurance process. It's the same assurance process. You select from the same list of approved third-party auditors. There's the same level of oversight of the Copper Mark. And again, that allows LME brands just a bit more flexibility in terms of what makes more sense for the operations, if it's a full scope of all sustainability topics or just a specific need to comply with LME. We do have a range of training modules as well, FAQs, and our team overall has many years of experience implementing and supporting companies to implement OECD-aligned due diligence in their supply chains across a number of different metals. And so we do very frequently provide one-on-one support to our participants in terms of helping them navigate questions on the process, on the audits, but also on due diligence itself in terms of how that needs to be implemented at their different sites. On the next slide, just a couple of information or a bit of information on the timelines and our recommended approach here if you are an LME brand and if you do need to comply by the end of this year. As I just mentioned, if you just do the joint due diligence standard, you still have to have the ISO certifications for environment and occupational health and safety. If you do the full copper mark, so the full criteria for responsible production, then as I said, you would automatically be complying with all three expectations. One of the benefits of going through a Track A assessment or using the copper mark is that you are then in our process and so on our timeline in terms of improvement. What I mean by that is if you are not fully conformant yet with the OECD guidance, so with the due diligence expectations, if you have what we call a partially meets, then you will still be, that will be sufficient for the LME because the LME essentially trusts the copper mark to make sure that you will close that gap within 1 year of signing up for a due diligence audit under the joint standard. So this really means that you will be coming into or you are part of the copper mark process. There is expectations for the third-party audit and then for timeframes to close out any gaps. And it does give you, in a way, a bit more flexibility in terms of communicating to the LME when you do have a partially meets. You do have to, though, submit your report by the 31st of December to the LME. And so very sort of common sense, that means you have to have your audit finished before the 31st of December, 2023. I would like to highlight that in our experience, it does take about a month between the end of your audit and the report being finished. That is taking into account the time that it takes the auditor to actually write the report, but also the time that it takes for the company to review the draft report, to make any changes to the accuracy of the facts in the report, to share that with us, for us to make sure that our methodologies and our assurance expectations were followed, and then finally to come to a report that all parties are in agreement on. And that's the version that would be shared with the LME. So that's something to keep in mind. If you are doing your audit on the 31st of December, you will not be able to share a report in time with the LME. And so our recommendation is for the assessments to be completed latest by October this year, so that you really have enough time to be able to finish the report writing process and submit the final document to the LME without there being, unnecessary time constraints on any of the parties involved in the process. On the next slide, just a few of the numbers here in terms of the participation. As you can see, we do have a number of sites, 4 that have gone just through the joint due diligence assessment. So again, they will have done only the joint due diligence standard. But what you can see really is the value of integrating the LME's requirements into the broader copper mark, because it really means that our participants, copper mark participants, are basically automatically complying with the LME, which has been quite a big benefit to them and in some cases a driver for participation in the copper mark, understanding that it helps you tick that box. So that is 25 sites that have gone through the copper mark process, have been audited against all 32 criteria, including the one on due diligence. Because we've already gone through 29 of these assessments, we do have some information on where the gaps are, and we thought it would be interesting to share that on the next slide with the audience here. Of the 29 assessments, on average, we had 2 findings in the 5 criteria. The 5 criteria here being to have a management system, do your risk assessment, risk mitigation, go through a third-party audit, and public reporting, in essence. So what you see here is that the majority of the findings are in step 1 and 5 in the management system and in the public reporting space. And that is quite indicative of the early stage of implementation in many of the participants. Essentially, what it means is that most of the sites we work with have established a management system, which is, compliant to a large degree with the LME's expectations, but there is some additional work that needs to happen in terms of fine-tuning or rolling out the management system across all supply chains or across all suppliers, for example. But a lot of the participants are actually at that stage where they have the management system designed and they're starting implementation. And so in many cases, very concretely, what participants have done is they have a management system, they have rolled it out to their top priority suppliers, but they haven't rolled it out to all the suppliers yet. And what that means then is they haven't completed a risk assessment either. So they haven't identified red flags, not necessarily because there are no red flags, but because they haven't been able to go through a full cycle of implementation. So they haven't been able to really go through all their suppliers and understand if there are any red flags. And then obviously, if you haven't gone through the full cycle of assessing risk, you also haven't done your risk mitigation because you don't know yet what the risks are. And so that's reflected kind of in the findings here. And I think considering the purpose of this webinar is important to highlight, right? We're not looking at participants expecting that everything's already done. We do understand this is an ongoing, continuous process. And so what we are assessing and what we are looking for is to say, right, do you have your systems in place? Do you have an initial set of public report that, that explains what you've done so far, how far you've come, what have you identified to date? And what is your plan to roll that out across the full supply base for the metals that you need to cover? And then from there, really, when we come back in a year's time or in 3 years' time, we will obviously then be looking at, have you actually now implemented this across your full supply base? What are the risks that you've identified? How have you mitigated those? So we are at the kind of early stage of implementation that is reflected in the findings that we are observing across our participant base. And so my main message today is hopefully one that reassures those of you who may be at the early stages as well in your implementation, to say you are in very good company. The important part is to get started here and to make sure that you're able to meet the LME's timelines. We are here to work with you. We are here to work with you through the remaining aspects of due diligence that will still need to be completed, but rest assured that this is an ongoing process, and we're here to support. And so now that I've given that hopefully reassuring message, Minyu, I'm going to hand it back over to you over what the hard stops and the deadlines are from the LME side. So we are making sure everyone is clear on those as well.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Michelle. So for LME brands who have selected joint due diligence standard or the full Copper Mark standard to reach Track A compliance, there are a couple of options, and I wanted to lay out and be transparent today on what those options are. And we do have, recommendations for what you should do immediately versus, if those aren't an option for you anymore, what the secondary options are. So from left to right of this flow chart, if you have not yet engaged with the Copper Mark yet, please reach out to the Copper Mark now. As Michelle mentioned earlier, it can take a long time from becoming a participant to with the Copper Mark to reach that audit and then eventually getting that assessment report from Coppermark. That can take a while. So if you have yet to engage with the Coppermark, please do so now and figure out, when to schedule your audit. And ideally that is before October of this year so that you get your assessment report on time. And if your assessment is planned for after 31st of December, that is also quite late, and it actually would not meet the LME's Track A deadline. So if that is your case, please do try to reach out to Coppermark immediately and arrange an earlier assessment so that you get your assessment report on time. And the third one, my assessment has not been scheduled yet. Although you are a Coppermark participant, please also do reach out to Coppermark and arrange an earlier assessment as soon as possible. And then if those are no longer an option for you, say you have not prepared to undergo an assessment and so on and so forth, you can reach out to the LME for other options to reach compliance to our responsible sourcing requirements. And the fourth one, my assessment will be completed and you will receive that assessment report by 31st of December 2023. Please just submit that summary report to the LME. Obviously, if you have undergone that assessment, have already received that summary report, we have already received some reports from producers that have undertaken the assessment already. So you do not have to wait until 31st of December to submit that summary report to the LME. And in the next slide, I will be talking about, what if LME brands cannot obtain the assurance this year and cannot obtain the summary report this year. The first one, which is probably quite clear and a very unpopular one, is the LME brand would undergo brand action, and that's either suspension or delisting of a brand. That is the last resort we want to leave here. We don't want to pursue that as the first option. So if you are able to schedule an earlier audit, if you are able to reach compliance through other options, please do so and reach out to us if you have additional questions. So suspension means your LME brand is no longer warrantable for a period of time until that suspension is been lifted. So in that time period, you might have done your assessment with Coppermark and you're just waiting for that report to come through. Say that's January of 2024. You might want to consider suspension for a brief amount of period, and then once you have that summary report, you can submit it to the LME, and then that suspension would then be lifted. And then you can also switch to another track if that's possible based on your situation. Say if track A is no longer an option for you and you think the timing just does not work for you anymore, you might want to consider track B or track C. Like I explained earlier, track B and track C are only available for those producers that do not discover any red flags in their supply chain. So in the process of filling out the red flag assessment template, if you've discovered any red flags, we would still refer you to track A. But I just wanted to give you the full spectrum of options today. And then, like I mentioned earlier, track D is for our producers who source 100% secondary materials for their LME brands. If you do wish to continue with track A through another standard, there are a few other options for you that's on slide 6, and we will disseminate the slide deck to our participants today after the presentation, so you can see what other standards are on slide 6. But I should caveat, all of the standards will take, if not the same, potentially more time. If you're already in the Coppermark kind of ecosystem, you've already been communicating with Coppermark, that kind of signing up process, you've already done so. And if you're switching to another standard and you're just considering them, they might also take quite a long time. So I wanted to tell you guys the option today, but I should mention going through another standard might take quite a long time as well. So I to summarize and reiterate the point, we do need to act fast as this is already the middle of the year. And then I should mention joint due diligence standard, as Michelle mentioned, is only criteria 31 of the full copper mark. So that will potentially take shorter time for you to get that certificate through joint due diligence standard. And then the upcoming LME responsible sourcing obligations, the first track B and track C deadline was 30th of June last year, and that's an annual obligation if you're going through track B or track C. And then so this year by 30th of June, you will also submit your track B audit report or the track C red flag assessment template. And the end of this year, 31st of December, I've already mentioned numerous of times your track A proof points, which means for a joint due diligence standard and copper mark, it would be the summary report that you would need to submit to the LME, and as well as the ISO 14001 and ISO 45001 certificates on that deadline as well. So post 2023, the LME works with Coppermark's timeline. So as Michelle mentioned earlier, say if your summary report doesn't expire until 2025, for example, you will be compliant to the LME's track A requirements until 2025. You do not have to communicate to us every single year, you know, we're still in compliance. We have that on record, and we will note that your summary report doesn't expire until then. So we work with Coppermark's timeline going forward post 2023. With that, I also wanted to highlight another opportunity with the LME. We always want to reward those brands or those producers that have done the good work in the sustainability space. So the Coppermark's assurance, as well as the joint due diligence standard assurance, they're voluntarily, you can disclose those credentials on LME Passport. It is a digital credential platform where you can voluntarily disclose your ESG credentials. And so we kind of take a carrot and a stick approach. Our responsible sourcing requirements are mandatory. So every LME brand has to comply with the LME responsible sourcing requirements, whereas the disclosure on LME Passport is voluntary. So if you have, you know, your ISOs that you want to disclose and showcase, you can disclose those on LME Passport. So I just wanted to highlight, you know, for example, Freeport-McMoRan has disclosed their Coppermark assurance on LME Passport, and so you can see, you know, what other producers might be doing and what other sustainability credentials they might be getting, so that you can also consider putting those and disclose those on LME Passport. So with that, I think we're ready for a question and answer session. You can either just unmute yourself to shout out your questions if that's allowed on Zoom webinar, or you can just post it in the chat function and we can monitor the chat and then answer your questions. I don't know, Michelle, if you're seeing any questions coming through.
Not on my end, no. There's a Q&A function, there's a chat you can use, or you can raise your hand. But nothing coming through so far. We must have been exceptionally clear with you.
Awesome. Well, if you do have questions and you don't want to, you know, ask it here, we always welcome those questions in our inboxes via email. We will have our contact information on the last slide. So in the future, if you want to ask any questions, please just do reach out to us. Also, okay, we do have a question. Can we change from track A to track B or C this year? Yes. So if say by October and you still are not able to get an assessment with Coppermark, or you think the timeline just will not work for your site, just let us know, and then we can work with you to make that switch from track A to track B or C this year. But the expectation is you would ideally know that before our 30th of June deadline as well, because that is the annual deadline for track B and track C. So short answer is yes, but we can further discuss how that looks like for your specific situation. Awesome. I'll give it a couple more seconds for other questions. Cool. If there are no other, okay, we do have another question. Is there any condition we need to switch track? It really depends. So if you are currently compliant to LME responsible sourcing requirements through track B or track C, and say during the last year, during the last reporting period, you discovered a red flag where you've had a additional supplier to your production, then you might want to consider switching to track A, because like I mentioned before, track B and track C are only for producers that do not have any red flags in their supply chain, because track B and track C have less oversight. They don't have that kind of actual audit in place to ensure there's no red flag. So by complying through track A with either say joint due diligence standard or Coppermark, you have that oversight and you have that support system from Coppermark, and they can provide you with additional resources that track B and track C cannot provide. And the next question, what is exactly expected to provide to the LME concerning the LME passports? Awesome. So in short, you just have to email us and tell us you would like to disclose whatever certificate you might have. You can reach out to responsible sourcing at lme.com and then tell us what you like to disclose. We have my colleagues Alice, Lim on my team, and other colleagues can help you to disclose those credentials on passport. So you basically just have to email us and then let us know. Next question, what is the best way to catch up with the deadlines if I so like I have shown on this slide, if you feel like you haven't signed up to Coppermark, or if you feel like it's going to be really challenging for you to meet the deadline via track A, please just let us know and we can work with you to figure out another option. Or if you're already part of the Coppermark's kind of infrastructure or ecosystem, however you want to put it, please reach out to the Coppermark and then ask if they can schedule an earlier assessment for you. But I hope the point of the webinar today is to urge you to do something to proactively ask questions and then figure out your options to meet our deadline. So I hope that point has come across from today's webinar. I don't know if you have anything to add to that one, Michelle.
No, not from my side.
Awesome. Awesome. So we have 10 more minutes. We can, as we do the next poll, you're welcome to post additional questions. We can answer them and monitor them as we do the poll. But after the webinar, we just wanted to gauge kind of how prepared you are. Do you understand what is now required of you? And then I think we're ready for the poll, Michelle, if you want to launch that one.
All right, happy to. I just launched it, so you should be seeing that pop-up window come back on your screen. I can see it is working. There's a few of you who are starting to respond. I mean, you had noticed there's one more question, I think, in the Q&A, if we can maybe after the poll get to that.
Yeah. And as people are kind of filling out the poll, I can read out, or I can look at the question as well and then address it after the poll.
Fantastic. We are still getting responses, so less motivated than in the first poll. I do realize we've kept you here for 50 minutes now. But if you do still have a little bit of energy left, please go ahead and respond to the poll. We have 18 responses so far. I'll just give it a little more time. A few more of you would be able to participate. Gives it a better of a sense. It is slowing down. I'll leave it open just a few more seconds. I have about 20 answers so far. So if you haven't responded, please do take a second to just indicate your preferred answer or the appropriate answer for where you are at after these 50 minutes before we close the poll. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll here. You just share the results again.
Awesome. So with the response we've gotten, it seems like more than half of our participants feel comfortable with their existing approach. I'm comforted by hearing that at least knowing more than half of our participants today are aware of the deadlines and are aware what they need to do. And we do have about 40% of participants that do need support from either Coppermark or the LME. And we're also glad to hear that, because this is the point of this webinar and that we're doing this in May so that people are aware of what their obligations are. So please do reach out to us with your questions, and we can support you either by a kind of bilateral call or we can take that onto email. Awesome. So with that, I'm going to address the last couple of questions that rolled in. I'm going to start with the easier one. So on page 14, it said that we could submit Coppermark summary report instead of JDDS assessment report. Is this understanding correct? So because joint due diligence standard and Coppermark, the full standard, are both recognized by the LME, you can comply through either one if you have both. But is my understanding correct, Michelle, if you have Coppermark, it basically kind of takes over the place for JDDS. You don't need to have both, right?
Yes, so in the full Coppermark, the JDD, the joint due diligence standard, will be integrated in your Coppermark assessment. And so the results will be integrated in your summary report for the full assessment. So the short answer is yes, you can submit the Coppermark summary report to the LME because it will have the joint due diligence standard already integrated in that summary report.
Yes, and I don't want to belabor the point about ISO equivalency. So if you have the full Copper Mark summary report and you have the fully meets level for criteria 12 and 13, you can also use your full Copper Mark summary report to meet our ISO requirements. So it's essentially a one report meets all responsible sourcing requirements situation that it covers all 3 items.
That's exactly right.
Yes. Next question, we as a company have different brands. Is it possible for some brands to go for track C, no red flags identified, and some other brands to go for track A, red flags identified? Yes, the answer is yes. So say, your producing site has multiple brands and then, or actually that is a wrong statement, sorry. If your company has multiple producing sites and then they have different supply chain practices and one of them you've identified red flags and you would like to comply through track A, then yes, you do have to meet our 31st of December deadline to submit a summary report. But for your other brands that do not have red flags, you just have to fill out the red flag assessment and either go through track B or track C. So that understanding is correct to that question.
If I may just add from the Copper Mark side, the Copper Mark works at a site level. So as you mentioned, it wouldn't be possible in the Copper Mark system to distinguish kind of within your site. So you would have to sign up an entire site to participate in the Copper Mark. That's the standard entity that we work with.
Thank you for that. Last question. How can we use the voluntary declaration of producers' environmental data in LME Passport as a guideline for sustainability performance? Any guidance for a scorecard? So we don't necessarily compare all of the disclosures on LME Passport. We are working with industry standards and other organizations to figure out a copper emissions methodology, for example, because we want to use the same methodology for a specific metal type. So if the scorecard is what you mean by that, then yes, that's in progress. But in terms of, for example, you are disclosing Copper Mark's summary report and the other person is disclosing, for example, joint due diligence standard, we don't necessarily compare them on the LME Passport. It's more for you to disclose those information for the public to see. I hope that answers your question, but if you have additional kind of concerns or follow-up questions regarding LME Passport, we can follow up via email. I remember some Copper Mark summary report were issued without JDDS assessment. I can take a stab at
that one.
Okay, yeah, Michelle, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, that is correct, and that is because the joint due diligence standard was launched slightly after the Copper Mark itself was launched. And so the very early participants in the Copper Mark, they were able to go through the process without the joint due diligence standard being available and implemented yet. That's why you have some summary reports that are not inclusive of the joint due diligence standard. So for those participants, if they are LME, if they have LME brands, they would have either done a separate joint due diligence standard assessment later on, so as a standalone, or the joint due diligence standard will be integrated in their regular reassessment cycle, which is every 3 years.
Awesome. And then I think the next question, I can take that one. The Copper Mark summary report, can it be acceptable if only criterion 31 is okay? The answer is yes. So the LME's responsible sourcing program, or we are only looking at that criterion that concerns, the implementation of OECD guidance. And so if criterion 31 is either partially meets or fully meets, then we will accept that. But the caveat is, if you would like to use that Copper Mark summary report and for your ISO equivalency, so say you want to submit that Copper Mark summary report for your ISO 14001 and 45001, and you do not have fully meets for criteria 12 and 13, then we cannot accept that for ISO equivalency. But for the OECD implementation one, we can accept it. I know that sounds a little complicated, and we can follow up additionally after this webinar. But in short, yes, we do accept it if only that your criterion 31 is fully meets or partially meets. Awesome. I don't see any more questions coming in. I have on the slide our contact details. Like I mentioned before, please reach out to us if you have additional questions. And especially for the participants who felt like after today's webinar, you do need more clarification or additional support from us, please let us know. We have our email and then my phone number. You can reach out to me via call if that's more comfortable for you. Coppermark also has a WeChat if you're based in China, and it will be easier for you to reach out to Coppermark via WeChat. But thank you so much, everyone, for participating in today's webinar, and thank you, Coppermark, for inviting me onto their webinar today. Michelle, do you have any additional comments?
Not from my side, just to thank you, Tuan Yu and the LME team for hosting this webinar with us today, and a big thanks to all the participants who joined us for this session. I hope it was useful, and will reiterate or emphasize also the availability of our team to support you. So especially for those of you who indicated needing support from the Coppermark, please do get in touch with us with the details on the slide here. We'll make sure you get to the right team member and that we are able to walk with you through this process. Thank you all for joining us today. And I think we knew with that, we are closing this webinar session, and wish you all an excellent rest of your day.